Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's Eastern time, and we will go ahead and get started. Feel free to come on camera if you'd rather people to see you. You're welcome to stay off as well, and just stay muted till the end. We'll have some time for some Q&A at the end of our time. So welcome. My name is Sam Heath. I'm the manager for Equal Justice USA's Evangelical Network. And what we're going to do today is have our bi-monthly repealing and healing session. And what that'll be is about a 30-minute time where I'll talk about who EJUSA is, what the Evangelical Network is, what's the work that we do, what's the theology behind it, and how to get involved. And then at the end, there will be some time for questions for you all. So anybody who's registered will get a recording of it as well if you need to head out early. And a lot of people registered, and it seems like a lot of people are going to be going on the recording. So I'm thankful that you all are here. Make note of any questions, or you can put anything in the chat as well if you want me to come back to that at the end. But let's go ahead and begin. So we do these every other month. I found out bi-monthly means 2 times a month or every other. So I'll be specific. The next one, we're going to push a little later because people travel in the summer, and it'll be Wednesday, August 24th. If you're not on our email list, go ahead and sign up so you can hear about that. It's a good thing to come to again to hear. You also can bring other people to it. So feel free to do that. So the name of it, what it is repealing and healing, and referencing two things, two big priorities that relate at EJUSA. Repealing is a reference to our desire to repeal the death penalty, both at the state and at the federal level. And then healing is our desire for the criminal legal system as a whole. We would say that it's primarily focused on punishment, and our hope is that it wouldn't ask questions about punishment, but that it would ask questions about healing. So that's what we're here to talk about today. So uniquely, though, we speak of these things at the Evangelical Network in other ways. We'll talk in a bit about the relationship of EJUSA and the Evangelical Network and how all of that fits in. But I'm going to start by speaking about how we talk about things specifically and especially to Christians. And we start with two questions. One is, who do we worship? And for Christians, we need to remember that we worship a criminal. We worship someone who was suffered, or who was suffering, someone who was rejected. The Bible calls him the suffering servant, as well as a man of sorrows. So it's important we remember, for Christians, at the center of our faith is Jesus, somebody who was arrested and tortured and persecuted and was executed by the state and gloriously was raised from the dead. So at the center of our faith is someone who was affected by that legal system in his day. The other question that guides a lot of what we do is to think about, who is my neighbor? It's a great question, but it's also one that was specifically asked of Jesus, and it solicited from him the parable of the Good Samaritan. And his answer with that parable ultimately was, of who is our neighbor? Anyone that we encounter who has a need. And part of what that parable is meant to do is to push us into a place of asking, well, then who is it who has a need? I hadn't seen this quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer until recently, but it struck me when I read it. And he said, "We must learn to regard people less in the light of what they do or omit to do, and more in the light of what they suffer." If we do that, it's not ignoring what people do, but if we take a lens of what is it that people suffer, not only will we be compelled to empathy, we will understand them better. It will transform how we engage people to think about their need. Despite whatever harm they may have done, there's always a need that's there as well. So I want to show you EJUSA's mission from our website so that you can see what that is, and a great picture of everybody. Give me 1 second and I'll get everything situated so screen sharing is easier for the rest of our time. So if you go to ejusa.org, and I'll email that to you all after this, you'll get an email after this with all the links to everything that I'll reference. So just know that. So ejusa.org, if you go, you'll see our mission right under the About Us part. So for Equal Justice USA, we'll start here. We're a national organization that works to transform the justice system by promoting responses to violence that break cycles of trauma. We work at the intersection of criminal justice, public health, and racial justice to elevate healing over retribution, meet the needs of survivors, advance racial equity, and build community. So that captures all the different facets of who we are and what it is that are our primary goals. So we're an organization that began in 1990, And in 2000, we began as a project of another organization. And in 2006, we spun off and formed our own group of Equal Justice USA. All through the 1990s, we were doing almost exclusively anti-death penalty work, both at the state and at the federal levels. And as we moved into the 2000s, started thinking about, well, if we did repeal the death penalty at the state and the federal level, we still would be left with a criminal legal system that is not just broken, but is primarily bringing harm. And I hesitate to say broken because in some sense, I would say the criminal legal system that we have is effective at doing what it's meant to do, which is protect interests of certain people, to persecute certain people, to bring punishment. It's effective at all of those things. So to say that it's broken assumes that its mission isn't being achieved. And part of what we'll talk about is that the mission of the system is absolutely being achieved. But if the death penalty was repealed, there still is this system bringing harm. And so EJUSA's vision started to expand to think through things with a trauma-informed lens. And with trauma as a centerpiece and taking that lens on people and on the system, it started to change everything that we did. Not only were we going to now look at the death penalty at the end of all things, but we were going to back up and look at all points of the criminal legal system and all the ways that people are engaged in that. And this was called our new paradigm. The Evangelical Network came on a bit later, and we'll talk about its origins. Our name of Equal Justice USA. So it's a reference to above the Supreme Court building in DC. The phrase is there, equal justice under law. And that's a reminder of what a hope is with our legal system, that our laws would be equally applied and that anybody going through the system would be able to receive equal treatment regardless of who they are or what's happened. That's not the case at all. Our laws back then and our laws now are absolutely not equally applied. And as Christians, this is really important. So we're saying something, but yet it's not true. And Christians talk about how love rejoices in the truth with 1 Corinthians 13, with that the truth sets us free. What we hear Jesus saying in John 8. So it's huge that we speak of what is true, what our system is and isn't, what it is and isn't doing, and also of our history. Christians are people that don't have to fear history or malign it, but can engage it regardless of the weight or weightiness that it might carry. Go back to 1868. In 1868, the 14th Amendment came, and that was passed. And the goal of the 14th Amendment after the Civil War was to guarantee equal protection under law for those that were born in the United States. Specifically, this was meant to make sure that it was applied to Black people within the United States who had formerly been enslaved. Noteworthily enough, this wasn't applied to Native Americans. In fact, they were explicitly excluded from that despite being born in the US. So from the beginning of this equal protection under law idea, it wasn't equally protecting those who were there. Then there are all sorts of instances where we see this not happening. What we see with the 14th Amendment and how it was applied inconsistently. So the amendment comes along and these laws ultimately get applied in really unequal or grossly unequal ways. And we have some shifts and movements in history. We shift from slavery, we move into Jim Crow, and ultimately now we move into a period of mass incarceration or of greatly imprisoning people, is another way to put it. It's important to think about what did and didn't happen with slavery and the fact that slavery wasn't actually abolished, it was just transformed. So if you go back a bit to the 13th Amendment, it's important to see in there that it talks about that slavery is abolished, but there's a clause there, except as punishment for a crime. So I want us to see that slavery wasn't something that was actually abolished, it was transformed, and it was placed under the jurisdiction of law enforcement and the courts. And so we fast forward to today and we have a system of mass incarceration. There's some facts that show that this is really a reality. Some of the big ones, we in the United States have 5% of the world's population, yet 20% of the world's prisoners, more than any civilization in the history of the world, more than any country right now within the world. We have about 2.3 million people who are incarcerated, which is about 1 out of every 100 people. We have the highest rate of incarceration, as we said, of anybody in the world. And we spend more money on incarcerated people than we do per student. We have 2,300 jails and prisons, and we even have a third of the world's female prisoners. Driving a lot of this, what we would argue, is fear, specifically fear of violence. A woman who's head of an organization called Calming Justice, in a book she wrote called Until We Reckon, she says these next few quotes that I'll reference. She talks about violence and how it's, quote, an expression of our values and history. And we're sitting in that, right? I saw Andrea in the chat referencing Buffalo. We had the events that happened in Texas as well. We are seeing the fruit of an obsession with violence and punishment in our country. Daniel Surratt also says that if incarceration worked to secure safety, we'd be the safest nation in all of human history. And I'd add, if punishment brought healing, we'd be the most healthy country within the world. But it's not. And she talks about how the system is both impractical and immoral. So the system is big, but we also incarcerate with disparity. So this fear that drives our system is especially a fear of Black and brown people. And we see that play out with disparities of those who the system affects. Black Americans make up 13% of the US population, yet 40% of those in prisons and jails. There are more Black men in our correctional system today than were enslaved in 1850. Half of those serving life without parole are Black, and 41% of those on death row right now are Black. So there aren't many options of what's going on here. Either something is grossly wrong with Black people, which is not true and a racist thing to think, or something has happened in our society to bring this about. Our criminal legal system is big, not just with incarceration, but at other points too. We have 1 million police officers in this country, and we over-police neighborhoods, we brutalize citizens, and we overburden and traumatize officers as well to maintain this system. Keep in mind the history of some of this with police officers. Police evolved from slave patrols, groups of men that were sent out often at night to capture slaves. And prisons themselves were a reform. It was a reform effort brought about by Quakers with the idea, misguided as it was, that isolation would lead to a changed heart. Prisons in places, lots of places today are still called penitentiaries. It's a reference to the monastic idea of penitence or repentance. And a cell within a prison is a reference to the cells that monks would live in. So there's always been this overlap with Christianity and prisons within the US. Christians have led in the effort to make prisons. They also have led in the effort to reform them, and Christians can lead in the effort to undo the harm. That's part of what the Evangelical Network is wanting to call Christians to do, to undo this harm that's happened. So the death penalty, let's talk about that for a second before coming back to some specifics of EJUSA. So there are 4 big claims I'd make about the death penalty. All of these are really data supported. So with the death penalty, we execute in our nation in a racist, expensive, torturous manner that doesn't deter crime. So if any of those things are a goal of the death penalty, to not do it in a racist way, to do it in a humane way, to do it in a cheap way or fiscally responsible way, or to deter crime, none of those things are achieved by it. We've executed about 16,000 people within this country. But since 1973, we've exonerated 187 people. We just had the 187th person just a few weeks ago who was exonerated and released from prison. Put another way, we've nearly murdered 187 innocent people. And those are just the ones that we know about of the thousands that we've executed in the history of our nation. Right now, there's 2,500 people on death row. But it's not just doom and gloom. There's momentum for change that's happening. The public support for death penalty, which was huge in the 1990s, is at an all-time low right now. 23 states and DC have repealed the death penalty. 13 states haven't had an execution in more than a decade, and 5 states have a moratorium on executions, Tennessee being the most recent, as of a few weeks ago. 70% of the world's nations have abolished it. So the United States is very much in a minority here if we compare this to things globally. So to summarize all that, we in our nation have created it, and we exist under a system that focuses on punishment rather than healing. We are uniquely gifted at breeding violence, at breeding killers. Again, we're seeing this happen within Buffalo and the shooting in Texas. We are reaping the fruit of what we have built here. Our actions show what we care about, right? And so do our laws. And it shows that we care more about punishing a wrongdoer than healing someone or bringing restoration to anybody, to the survivor, the surrounding community, or the person who offends. All of this made me think about C.S. Lewis and his famous mud pie quote. He says, "We are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered to us. like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at sea. We are far too easily pleased. This is true of our criminal legal system as well. We are far too easily satisfied with our criminal legal system. The system, another point that we want to make and really impress on us is that the system harms everybody within it, not just those who are incarcerated, but everybody who's surrounded within it. I think about one of the former wardens who was a warden in a prison in Florida and Georgia, Ron McAndrew, and he was over 8 executions. And he still at night talks about how when he goes to sleep at night, he sees the dead of those that he's executed sitting at the bottom of his bed. Now, whether real or the way that he's processing trauma, what this is emphasizing is people are affected by these things, regardless of the level of involvement that they have with it. They're literally haunted by a lot of this. I want us to think about violence as being a public health crisis. And so, like disease, it's something that we can both treat and prevent. One good phrase to think about this is that hurt people, but the reverse is true too, of healed people, heal people. And we know often how people are hurt. And as a society, we know often how to heal people. We know what it looks like, and we know how to keep people safe. And we know the importance of bringing accountability. I'd absolutely say when a crime happens or when violence happens, something is owed there. And I think what's owed, though, is accountability. I don't think that it's punishment. I don't think that it's pain. And by accountability, I mean 3 steps. And all 3 of these are really key kind of in the arc of helping engage someone who's brought about harm. So with accountability, 1, it's acknowledgement, acknowledging the harm that someone has done, acknowledging the effect that's had on the person who's the victim, the survivor. 2, it's some act of repair. That person who's done the harm actually needs to physically do something to repair that. Again, I don't think that's isolation unless we're talking about an extreme safety issue, but that person can do something to work towards amends, to work towards healing for the person that they'd harmed. So acknowledgement, repair, and the third thing is change. That person or situation or things around that person should change so that that thing that happened, that harm, isn't able to happen again. So when we hurt someone, something is owed. What's owed is some kind of healing, some kind of repair or restoration, and that takes work. This is the opposite of being soft on crime. Prison is soft on crime because it's completely passive. It just requires someone's endurance. It's not saying that prison is easy, but it's saying that if we're talking about what it's requiring of someone with regard to their healing or others, it requires nothing of their own healing or for other people. So to require someone to move towards restoration or to call someone towards that restoration is difficult, but it affects all of those parties, the survivor, the person who did the harm, and that person's surrounding community. So we often think in our country that mass incarceration is the problem with all of this, but think more about mass incarceration as a symptom. And it's a symptom of some underlying problems, things like trauma, things like poverty, things like inequity, and then our fear that we have of dealing with those things. And because we have a fear of dealing with those things and we neglect to deal with those core problems, it's going to lead to violence. And that violence leads to mass incarceration, and the cycle begins again. In a lot of ways, for a lot of people, our response to hearing this and engaging these matters is anger. And underneath anger is almost always some form of fear. But as Christians, we talk about righteous anger, and righteous anger is a good thing. We should be angry when we hear or come across injustice. An author, Dan Van Ness, talks about the idea how people are animated by anger, and that's very, very true. But it's also key to think people are not sustained by anger. One thing I try to impress upon Christians when I talk with them, as I ask Christians to put secondary and tertiary identities at risk, whether that be being wealthy or privileged or white or male or whatever other identity someone might have of race, age, stage of life, socioeconomic status, ability, whatever that might be, I want to impress on people, particularly Christians, one, we're made in the image of God, and that's an identity that doesn't change. But for Christians, being a son or daughter of the King isn't something that alters or leaves. You can put all these other identities at risk, and at risk for the sake of other people, and still hold on to that thing. Psalm 10 talks about breaking the arm of the wicked. That's not something that's done in a soft way. That is a strong call to end violence and to move against injustice. And Christians should be emboldened both by that command and by the identity that they're able to hold on to. Back to EJUSA. So we took all of these things I've talked about, this history, these ideas, this state of things. And in 2017, EJUSA decided to start thinking about bringing this new paradigm in a trauma-informed way. So we started asking questions about things, and chiefly among them this question of what is justice? So I want to show you this. When we talk about what justice is, often our answer is that justice is punishment within the United States. What I'm going to offer is that justice isn't punishment. We want to turn away from that and look towards something else, towards safety, healing, and accountability. So when violence occurs, people are impacted, but the hope and the goal of what we want to ask is not just who caused harm and how do we punish, but who is harmed and how can there be healing? Because when justice equals punishment, no one is receiving the things that they actually need. What the system promises is that healing, safety, and accountability come from the criminal legal system. Not only does it not bring that, the system is bringing actively the opposite of those things. The system itself is perpetrating that violence and breeding that violence. And if that's true, we have to break that cycle, and we have to look often outside the system toward this other definition of justice. And the key connecting all of these things is to think about trauma, the trauma of everyone, the trauma of the community, the trauma of the survivor, the trauma of the person who did the harm. All of these groups have experienced trauma. Anybody who does an act of violence also has had an act of violence done to them, which does not excuse it, but helps explain how trauma affects everyone. And so by taking that lens of trauma, it allows us to reimagine justice and to think about it in some new and some different ways. And so at the Evangelical Network, we began doing that in some uniquely Christian ways. So here's our website, evangelical.usa, ejusa.org. And so in 2017, the Evangelical Network was formed to reach out to people of faith, especially Christians and especially evangelicals within the United States, to talk about these things. Wheaton College estimates that there are between 90 and 100 million self-identified evangelicals in the country. That's a massive group. And so the Evangelical Network was formed to reach out to those individuals, to talk about these things, to ask these questions, to call them to engage in all of this work. So let me say what an evangelical is and what that means to us. When we talk about evangelical, I'm speaking about it mostly from a theological definition. So the word evangelical is based on the Greek word evangelion, which is a reference to the gospel of Christ coming and living, defeating Satan, sin, and death, and that he's raised from the dead. Another way to think about being an evangelical comes from a British historian named David Bebbington. And the Bebbington quadrilateral is a fancy term for four things that are really important to evangelicals: Scripture, the Bible, that it's God's word; conversion, there's a moment in someone's life of being saved, which the person may or may not remember, but there is this moment of change of someone's heart. Social activism actually has been part of the evangelical pillar for all time. And then the cross, the importance of the cross and this work of Jesus and what it is that he's doing. So all four of those are key evangelical beliefs, but yet we often see a divide between evangelicals. And I'd separate evangelicals into a couple groups and two different streams. And here I'm rephrasing some of Kristen Kobes-Dumay's work. She's a scholar who wrote a book called Jesus and John Wayne. And the language that I'll use is there are cultural evangelicals and there's theological evangelicals. Now, the evangelical that we say at the Evangelical Network is that theological definition. This word is 500 years old. This word goes back to the gospel. It goes with those four things and is so much more than that. But a cultural evangelical is going to largely think of things in a political or a partisan way. And cultural evangelicals have been huge, at least since Richard Nixon, peaking with Reagan and Donald Trump as well. And evangelicals are a huge group, right? I already told you it's 100 million people, and it's a spectrum. Brian Stevenson of Equal Justice Initiative and Donald Trump of Donald Trumpness both would say that they're evangelicals. And those two men are likely not agreeing on many things. So this is a massive group. So the goal is to reach out to all evangelicals, but with a theological evangelical stance to talk about these things, both to invite evangelicals into our work and to come alongside Christian churches, denominations, Christian spaces to see what work are you doing and how can we accompany you within that work? How can we come alongside you in those things that you are already doing? So the work that we do falls under 5 categories, or we'd say there's 5 issues that we engage or think about. I'll show you those and talk about the theology behind those. So the 5 issues that we would talk about as a whole at EJUSA as engaging would be healing justice. So here we'll talk about things like trauma, things like restorative justice programs. The second is violence reduction, especially violence reduction and community-based violence intervention. Trauma-informed policing, especially policing, but also broadly trauma-informed systems. The death penalty, we continue that work. That's still a vast part of what we do. And then racial equity, which is less of an issue and more a lens that all of these things are viewed through, because to engage the criminal legal system is to engage the story and history of race at all levels. One thing that we did at the Evangelical Network early on was to take these ideas that have been part of EJUSA for years and to filter them through a biblical lens. Because I want to show to Christians what we're doing is not an add-on, but it is an outworking of the love of Jesus itself. It is a response to the gospel itself. So on our website, and again, I'll send you this link, is a document that we've called a theology of our platform. And so it reinforces how all of these things are based in Scripture, based in a love of and out of the work of Jesus. So we go through each of these. We talk about how racism is a heresy. We talk about the death penalty and how we are called toward life. We talk about trauma-informed systems and the importance of seeing both individuals and institutions. We talk about violence reduction and how Christ has called people, especially the church, to put down and not pursue the sword. We talk about healing support. And again, that question of who is my neighbor? And the answer is anybody who has need. And so we must ask that question of who is it that has need and what are those needs that are out there that people have? Couple things before we wrap up and pause and take some questions. So some practical things with the Evangelical Network. We're a national group, and so we're reaching out to people all across the country. And we also have an advisors group. So counting me, there's a group of 6 people that come around the work that we do to talk about it, to think about it, to pray for it. They're a group that has helped shape that theology in that document. And it's a Google Doc because part of this is evolving. We're continuing to learn, how does the Bible bring itself to bear on living these things out? And so we're growing and learning and hearing from others. But that advisors group meets every quarter and is a huge help to me in thinking about all of this, and then also taking it into their spheres and institutions and doing the work. We have historians, theologian there, a man who was formerly incarcerated, a state death penalty leader, a pastor. So we've tried to gather a group of men and women from different institutions to help shape this work as we move forward. All right, some final things. Martin Luther King has talked about how Christians are called not just to care for the man who was beaten and robbed on the road to Jericho, right? This parable of the Good Samaritan, but he talks about fixing the road. It's so key at the Evangelical Network that we see both individuals, but that we also see institutions and systems. We want individuals to receive healing. We also want that to come at an institutional or a systemic level. I think about shalom in Revelation 21, where it talks about wiping away every tear. That is a global project that we're called to. Ultimately, Christ does that when he returns. And there's a measure of that we can achieve here as we see the kingdom continue to break forth into the world. What I'll end with is showing you a document, again, that I'll send you later on so you can look at it more. But I want you to see that it's called, How Can I Get Involved? So if any of these things are interesting to you, or if you want to hear more, one, I'm happy to and would love to chat with you more about it. You can sign up for the Evangelical Network email list. You can come to another Repealing and Healing session. Again, the next one is August 24th. I would encourage you to bring someone with you, someone who might be interested, someone who might be opposed, and have a conversation about what you hear here. We also now this one's every month, have a webinar series called In the Movement. And for an hour, I sit with someone who's in the justice movement, talk about this person's work And then people who come have a chance to ask questions. The next one is with Aaron Griffith, who wrote a book called God's Law and Order, The Politics of Punishment in Evangelical America. He is on our advisors group. And so this will be June 15th in just a few weeks. And he's brilliant at talking about the evangelical affinity for punishment and historically why that makes sense, why it's not a good thing, but he traces the thread of why that makes sense and how we got where we are. We have a resources list as well of things you can read, listen, and watch. We have a statement that captures some of these things that I've said. And then there are other ways that you can take action. There are other ways that you can take leadership within your communities. So I'll send you this so that you have some time to go through that and think about some ways that you might want to get involved. And again, I'm happy to meet and talk with all of you. So Wednesday, August 24th is the next one. Come again, bring someone with you who you can dialogue with about this. And let me pause here and see if you all have questions. You're welcome to put anything in the chat or give any commentary. We've had excitement and angst both in this space. So feel free to bring any thoughts, feelings, or questions.